Good morning, fourth grade. Over the past week, we have been learning about different environments, the ecosystems, and the different organisms that live in each environment. We discussed each role that each organism plays in its home. What we will be doing today is we're going to be adding some of these ecosystem vocabulary into our journal. To get started, please open up your journal to page 2 and let's set up our journal with our entry topic and on what page it will be. So first, you want to write today's date, which is 04/19. The topic we are adding is ecosystems vocabulary, and we are adding it on page 36. We'll give you guys about 2 minutes to add that into your table of contents. Now that you have added that into your table of contents, we can go ahead and start our lesson. We will be reading our FOSS ebook, and as we read, we will be pausing throughout to add the different vocabulary words onto page 36. Let's begin reading our FOSS ebook. Food chains and food webs. In any ecosystem, a lot of eating is going on. Do you remember why? Eating is the way animals get the food they need to survive. What is it about food that makes life possible? Food is the source of matter and energy. The matter in food provides the raw materials an organism needs to grow and reproduce. Food gives us energy so that we are able to grow. Energy is like the fuel that makes things happen. One way to think about ecosystems is who eats whom. When you know how an organism gets its food, you can put it into a group. In an ecosystem, there are food webs and food chains, and each different organism plays a different role. For example, in this picture, we see this deer eating grass. The grass is giving energy to the deer. Before we continue, let's add the vocabulary of ecosystem into our journal. Open up to page 36 and add the vocabulary word ecosystem to page 36. An ecosystem is a community of organisms interacting with each other in its non-living environment. I will give you guys about 3 minutes so you can add the title, Ecosystems Vocabulary, and the date 04/19 to page 36, and also add the vocabulary word for ecosystems. Now that you have added the ecosystem vocabulary, let's keep reading our FOSS ebook so that we can learn the different roles organisms play in its environment. Let's talk about food chains. When a spider eats a fly, the matter and energy in the fly go to the spider. This feeding relationship can be shown with an arrow. The arrow always points in the direction that the matter and energy flow. So the spider eats the fly and the fly gives its energy to the spider. If a praying mantis eats a spider, the matter and energy in the spider go to the praying mantis. From the fly to the spider to the praying mantis. It's one big chain how the energy is being transferred. It's possible in a woodland ecosystem for a blue jay to eat the praying mantis, a weasel to eat the blue jay, and a hawk to eat the weasel. Matter and energy pass from one organism to the next when they are eaten. This is called a food chain, and at the beginning of the food chain is a producer. Each food chain is started out with a producer. Energy for producers come from the sun. We will learn a bit more how producers get their energy from the sun on our next slide. On our food chain example here, the producer is a fruit from a tree, a plum. You can draw arrows from one organism to the next to describe a food chain. The arrows show the direction of energy flow. They point from the organism that is eaten to the organism that eats it. So a plum, which is a producer, is eaten by a fly. A fly is then eaten by a spider. A spider is eaten by a praying mantis, which gets its energy from the spider. The praying mantis is then eaten by a blue jay. A blue jay is then eaten by a weasel, and a weasel is then eaten by a hawk. This is how the energy from a plum travels through all these different organisms and it eventually gives to a hawk. There is also another example of a food chain, which is a food web. Since there are many different relationships or different ways animals can be eaten, we can also use a food web. If you draw all the arrows that show who eats whom, you have a food web, not a food chain. The food web for a freshwater river may look like this. For example, we have algae at the bottom, and the algae can either be eaten by mosquitoes or mayflies. We also have water plants, which are eaten by crayfish and mayfly. When we're on our mosquito and mayfly level, a mosquito can be eaten by a bat or a minnow. A minnow can also get its energy from a mayfly. However, a minnow can be eaten by a crayfish. A crayfish can be eaten by an egret, a sea bass, or an alligator, and a bass can be eaten by an alligator. Sounds very confusing because there are different organisms which can eat different animals, but that's why we should use a food web instead of a food chain to show what different animals can eat an organism. Let's turn to page 36 in our journal to add the definition of food webs. A food web is a description of the feeding relationship between organisms. It uses arrows to show the flow of energy. So right below ecosystem on page 36, add the definition for food web into your journal. You have about 2 minutes to add that into your journal now. Alright, now that you have added the food web vocabulary into your journal, now let's talk about the different parts different organisms play in these food webs. There are different groups of the different organisms play. Let's start with the first one, which are producers. Some organisms don't eat anything. They don't have to because they make their own food. Organisms that make their own food are called producers. In terrestrial ecosystems, the most important producers are plants. Plants get their energy from the sun and are able to use the process of photosynthesis to turn it into energy. Grasses, trees, and bushes are all producers. In freshwater and ocean ecosystems, algae are the most important producers. Producers use the food they make as a source of matter and energy. They don't eat other organisms for matter and energy. Any organism that makes its own food is a producer. Let's turn to page 36 in our journal to add the definition of producer. An organism that makes its own food. Some examples are plants and algae. Right below food web, you can add the definition of producer. You have 2 minutes to add that into your journal now. We have now added producer into our vocabulary journal. Let's keep reading our FOSS ebook to learn about the other types of organisms in a food web. Other types of organisms are consumers. Consumers are organisms that eat other organisms, are consumers. Consumers can't make their own food. Consumers have to eat other organisms to get their matter and energy. See the word consumers? The root word is consume, which means to eat. So consumers eat other animals. Let's pause right there and open up our journal to page 36 so that we can add consumers into our journal. You will have 2 minutes to add the definition of consumer, which is an organism that cannot make own food. They eat other organisms for energy. Add that into your journal now. Alright, you have now added consumers into your journal, but we're gonna finish reading our false ebook because there are three different types of consumers. Let's continue reading our false ebook so we can learn about these different consumers. Alright, let's start our next paragraph here. Some consumers eat plants and plant parts. For example, deer eat grass and leaves, gophers eat roots, squirrels eat grass, nuts, and berries, caterpillars eat leaves. Animals that only eat plants to get their food are called herbivores. They are still consumers, but they only eat plants. Herbivores only eat plants. Right below consumers, you can write the first type of consumer, which is an herbivore, an animal that only eats plants. You have 2 minutes to add this into your journal. Alright, now that you have added herbivore into your journal, let's keep reading our false ebook to add our second type of consumer. Some animals don't eat plants. Snakes don't eat nuts and berries. Hawks don't eat grass. And spiders don't eat leaves. So how do they get their matter and energy? They eat other animals. Snakes and hawks eat gophers and squirrels. Spiders eat insects. These animals that eat other animals are called carnivores. This is our second type of consumer. Carnivores are animals that eat other animals. Let's add the definition for carnivores into our science journal. You have 2 minutes to add that into your journal. Alright, we have talked about herbivores who eat plants, carnivores which only eat animals. Let's finish reading our FOSS ebook to see what other type of consumers they are. Some consumers, like humans, bears, raccoons, robins, and crayfish, eat both plants and animals. They are called omnivores. The third type of consumer is called an omnivore. Omnivores eat both plants and other animals. So go into your FOSS ebook and let's add the definition of omnivore, an animal that eats plants and animals. You will have 2 minutes to add the definition for omnivore into your science journal. Alright, we have added our three types of consumers, which are herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. These are the different types of consumers. We also talked about producers, which make their own food. These are all part of an ecosystem. You should have now added all three of these into your journal. Tomorrow we will continue discussing what other roles other organisms play within a ecosystem. Please make sure your journal is up to date with all the vocabulary. If you have any questions, please make sure you visit me during office hours or stop by my live stream. Remember to watch all our daily lessons, and I will see you tomorrow. Have a great day.